This is Eye on Bankruptcy, brought to you by the American Bankruptcy Institute. For those who have paid for the optional CLE, be sure to note the CLE code that will pop up throughout the presentation.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Doug Foley. I'm a partner at McGuire Woods, based here in Washington, D.C., and we're proud to sponsor this live program again of Eye on Bankruptcy. For those of you who don't know, Eye on Bankruptcy is a monthly program of current legal developments, now in its 5th season, I believe, and it's produced by the ABI. The show airs every last Thursday of each month at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. There is a website, eyeonbankruptcy.com, that contains archives of more than 50 programs that you can watch on demand featuring leading practitioners, judges, and scholars. Also, the show qualifies for an hour of CLE credit, which is good in states where it is pre-approved. Again, although we normally come to you from the ABI's studio in Alexandria, Virginia, across the river here from Washington, today we have a very special program on a very vitally important topic, so I would ask you to please welcome Professor Charles Tabb and his guest, Harvey Rishikoff. Thank you.
Welcome to the April episode of Eye on Bankruptcy, a monthly discussion of recent cases and developments in the bankruptcy world, produced, of course, by the American Bankruptcy Institute. This program will give you 1 hour CLE credit in states where it is pre-approved. My name is Charles Tabb. I am the Mildred Van Voorhis Jones Chair in Law at the University of Illinois College of Law. And by the way, Nathan Yeary was my student. I'm very proud of him. In this semester, I'm the Jack Pritzker Distinguished Visiting Professor of Law at Northwestern. I'm also of counsel with the law firm of Foley and Lardner in Chicago, and I'm your host for Eye on Bankruptcy. Today, as you know, we have a special live program. Our topic is the national security implications. It's quite a mouthful. The national security implications of foreign exfiltration of high-tech assets through bankruptcy. As described in the program, it says, nation-states with adverse interests to the United States are increasingly using bankruptcy courts and investment and venture capital firms to secure access to sensitive American technology. Our guest explains how and what bankruptcy courts can do about it, and we are fortunate to welcome our very distinguished guest, Mr. Harvey Rishikoff.
Thank you.
Let me tell you a little bit about Harvey's career, and as you'll see, and I think you'll agree with me, there's no one who would be better qualified to discuss this topic with us. His career includes experience in both the private sector, academia, and in public service in the executive and judicial branches. He has quite a resume. He specializes in national security law, international law, media, civil liberties, civilian military relations, governmental process, and the U.S. Constitution. At lunch, we were just talking about some con law cases he was just teaching his students this week. This year, he's a visiting professor at Temple Law School. Prior positions for Mr. Rishikoff include senior counsel at Crowell & Moring, the dean of the faculty at the National War College, and he held a joint appointment at Drexel University in both the law school and the College of Information Science and Technology. His last government position was as senior policy advisor to the Director of National Counterintelligence for the Director of National Intelligence, and before that he served as legal counsel to the Deputy Director of the FBI. Before he joined the government, he was at the National Defense University National War College here in Washington, served as professor of law and chaired the Department of National Security Strategy. Harvey's a lifetime member of the Council of Foreign Relations as well as the American Law Institute. He was administrative assistant to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court from 94 to 96. He had been a law clerk with the, we were discussing this, the iconic Honorable Leonard Garth for the Third Circuit. And he was chief of staff then for Chief Justice Rehnquist, which of course meant he was involved in a lot of issues involving the federal court system. He has authored many publications. Most recent book, last edition came out just a couple years ago. The title is The National Security Enterprise, Navigating the Labyrinth. So Harvey, welcome to Eye on Bankruptcy. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us about national security implications of foreign exfiltration of high-tech assets. So preliminarily, if you're like me, in preparing for this program, which I got, I had to look up what exfiltration meant. I should have been able to figure it out, but it was a new word for me. And what it means, it's a pretty fancy word. It means to remove furtively from a hostile area, to withdraw surreptitiously from an enemy area. You basically can figure it out if you realize it's the opposite of infiltration. So, you know, infiltration is sneaking something in, exfiltration, sneaking something out. And what we're looking at today, our topic, is the exfiltration of sensitive, very important technological data from the United States by a potentially hostile power. The most common actors, apparently, I read, are China, North Korea, Russia, and Iran. And most often, I think, by China. So, in talking about this, what I want to do to just kind of frame it for you is to focus on 5 questions. And shortly, Harvey's going to be doing all the talking because he's the one that actually knows something about this. But the 5 questions I want to focus on are these. First, what exactly is the nature of the problem? What are we talking about? Secondly, how does this happen? Third, why aren't existing protections and safeguards enough? I mean, why are we still having a problem? Fourth, should we care? And if so, why? And fifth and last, is there anything we can do about it? To kind of get the ball rolling here, what I wanted to do, Harvey and I have talked about this, for those of you who are avid readers, I'm sure, the ABI Journal, and read it cover to cover and memorize it, you'll recall a couple months ago, I believe it was in the February issue, there was a discussion of a case involving a California chip designer named A-Top Tech. And what happened in that case, which Harvey's going to tell you a lot more about in just a second, basically in a bankruptcy sale, A-Top Tech's assets were sold to this company named Avatar Integrated Systems, which it turns out was an entity controlled by a very important Chinese steel magnate, a fellow named Jingguan Han, through his Hong Kong-based company. So, Harvey, time for me to stop talking and get the ball to somebody that knows what they're talking about. Tell us about the A-Top Tech case and what happened.
Well, first, Charles, thank you. And I want to particularly thank Sam for putting this together. But I had thought there would be liquor at lunch, because I usually go down a lot better with liquor than just straight sober. So, Sam, I'm a little bit confused about why there isn't more hard liquor on the table. But I also want to thank Judge Sid Brooks, who's very important in making this happen, and an old friend. And I'll be quoting a lot from Camille Stewart, who has a paper that will be coming out in the Georgetown Law Review on this issue. And finally, it's an honor to share the stage with Charles, who's a bankruptcy legend, to be here. So you couldn't be in better hands. So let me just frame the problem. And first also, let me say, these are my remarks. They are not the remarks of the Department of Defense, the National Intelligence University, the American Bar Association, or Temple, or any institution I'm affiliated with. But why? It's always not good when I show up to a group. Because my life has been in counterintelligence and national security. And what we're finding now is that our adversaries are seeing the bankruptcy space as an opportunity in order to garner certain types of technology and access to certain types of technology that they would like to have for their advantage. So in the book that Charles referenced, which is used a lot in international relations and professional military education, I and my co-authors did not raise the issue of supply chain. And I would say to you now that the Department of Defense and a number of other major sort of core industries in the critical infrastructure have become laser focused on how we understand the concept of supply chain. And supply chain has 4 key vulnerabilities, of which the bankruptcy areas you'll see why we're starting to focus on you. The first is software, which is there's an inherent weakness in software. And how many of you usually do your patches and when you were told to do it on a regular basis on Patch Monday? So the number of hands are going up. So I say that means your product was defective for at least 3 days. And the only people I know who spend that amount of money on a defective product, how many also own Jaguars? So this is sort of an interesting phenomena. But what we've created in the market in software is we've gone first to the market without worrying about security. So we've created 2 very efficient markets that are making a lot of money, but are not providing security. The first is we're bringing the software to market as soon as possible. And I imagine most of you are involved in having security systems and cybersecurity systems that you pay a lot of money for, and they come in after there's been a breach of some sort. So both markets are working extremely well, except they're not actually providing security. The second major vulnerability is hardware. So I imagine most of you have your Apple phone with you now, or you have your Droid. Do you have any grasp of what's in that particular hardware, where its provenance has been, which is where the ATOP case comes in? Because the ATOP case, what they did was they built semiconductors, and they were involved in providing that sort of conduits for what's becoming the core for most of our electronic equipment. But more importantly, what the company was focused on was what's sort of called the space and route inside the actual chip. So they had a specialization in doing that. And then that chip gets going to incorporate into many other levels of products. So if you're worried about an adversary who's going to compromise the platform, if you can do that very early in the chip production, you have an incredible comparative advantage, so that in the event when that is actually brought into the major platforms and built upon, if someone can control that chip, or that chip has a particular defect, you will render multi-billion-dollar platforms useless. So I'm always reminded of the famous incident when the Challenger went down, and they brought in the famous physicist Feinstein to come in. If you remember, he dramatically showed, well, how did this whole system go down from NASA? How was that possible? And he said, well, it just was the O-ring. And he dropped the O-ring into a glass of ice. And then he took it out after a few seconds and said, you see, the O-ring has lost its elasticity. Well, this O-ring was supposed to be a gas blocker. And when that gas got into the engine of the liftoff, that exploded it. So this thing that cost about 2 cents, this completely brought down the Challenger.
Wow.
And then when you ask, well, why the engineering company was Theocal, how many engineers are in the room, people with engineering degrees?
And are willing to admit.
And admit it in public. Wow, okay, no one's willing to admit it. Because usually, bankruptcy, patent law. So the engineers, they knew when it was cold, there was a higher probability of mission launch failure. But they were not able to present that to NASA's policymakers in a manner that they fully understood. They didn't have good lawyers articulating what their problem was. And so now we're here with us trying to articulate why we're interested in this bankruptcy area because in the high-tech space, we've identified about 27 industries that we think are critical going forward to maintain our supply chain. Simultaneously, the Chinese have identified in their 2025 plan a similar set of industries they are committed to because they are of the conviction that whoever controls AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and this technology will be able to have a comparative advantage as we move forward in the 21st century. So for my group, we believe this is an inflection point. The similar way we had an inflection point almost 60 or 70 years ago when we started the Manhattan Project. And we started the Manhattan Project, we then created the capability of nuclear power, which was transformative for what subsequently happened in the Cold War. And as I was telling to Charles, we then used that nuclear power to then build our submarine nuclear force under Admiral Rickover, which then generated a strategic part of our triad, which became one of the core elements of deterrence in the 21st century. We are saying that we have a similar feeling that technology is equivalent to this notion of where we were with nuclear, and whoever gets to control and understand this space, we believe will be truly able to dominate and have a true advantage. At this point, the peer competitor that we have is clearly China. And what Charles alluded to, when I was at the counterintelligence executive in 2011, we published the first non-classified document on economic espionage in which we called out Russia, China, and Iran as advanced persistent threats on our system. We also called out at that time Huawei, which has now become much more popular in the news. And we had suspicions about Kaspersky and ZTE. And it's taken us almost a decade for us to call those entities out as not being fair players in the market. And what the ATOP was, as to get back to the bankruptcy part of this argument, our adversaries are looking at these 27 industries that they believe are critical for them to go forward. They scan to see who's in distress. Can they come in a bankruptcy proceeding, shielded with unclear if it's going to be actually China or another advanced high-tech adversary, buy up the assets, take control of the product, and then our fear is the redesigning at the critical level of the path and gateway, which is what Top A represented, in a manner to control the line when ultimately, if it's a Chinese-related company, the Chinese government believes that the companies are an extension of their power. We call them state-owned enterprises, SOEs, and that at some point in time, when they need to have that entity perform the national state function or national security function, they will be at the beck and call of the adversary. And bankruptcy is a clever way to get things on the cheap. We also had the 123 battery company that came out, similarly purchased. And when we started in the government coming forward and saying that would have to go under CFIUS, which I don't know how many guys have come across and how much our CFIUS lawyers, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, they started to back away from the CFIUS process, but they were looking for the bankruptcy because at that time, bankruptcy was not covered by CFIUS. And there would not be what we say more of an open kimono presentation of who was behind the white knight coming in to buy the company. So that's my short answer.
Yeah. No, that's it. What
I think that really helps us to see, like, just an example, like what the nature of the problem is and how it happens. I'd like for you to, which were the first two things I wanted us to ponder, but I want to talk some more about something you alluded to, which is the sort of the third big question, which is, aren't there existing measures in place? And you referred, of course, to CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. Tell us a little more about CFIUS and what they do, and we'll also talk about some of the other potential protections, export control, and so forth. Sure. But talk about what CFIUS does and why there's still a vulnerability. Because I mean, one thing we're looking at is, as you and I have discussed, if this weren't in bankruptcy, what ended up happening in a case like Top Tech would be difficult to happen. So kind of walk us through what CFIUS does, how this plays, and why there are gaps and weaknesses in the bankruptcy space.
So like many of you, judging by the age of the audience, we grew up with the Washington Consensus. And the Washington Consensus was, we deeply believed in competition, we deeply believed in democratic institutions, and we deeply believed in our foreign policy was to have everyone's boats rise in competition as these countries would develop more prosperous middle classes. Those middle classes would lean on political authoritarian regimes for more power in order to make their institutions more democratic. Friedman used to say, because it's no longer true, if you had McDonald's in your country, you didn't go to war. Right? That there was a standard of living issue that became rational and a consensus. I would put it to you, that is an assumption which is unclear anymore if it's viable. Can you have economic growth without political participation and democracy? I think the Chinese are demonstrating, we call it's a different operating system, and will that operating system be successful versus our operating system? So, as Charles alluded to, we created quite a legal framework of alphabet soup. So we had EAR, Export Administrative Regulations, run by Commerce. We had ITAR, which was run out of state, which was the Internal Trafficking and Arms Regulations. We then created CFIUS to look at foreign investment. Have any of you ever been on a CFIUS board? So they
can't tell you.
They can't tell me? No, you can. I'm a member of a CFIUS board. It's when Company A is bought by, Company A has government-related contracts in related industries. Company B, as a foreigner, comes in to buy it. If it has classified contracts and particular issues dealing with DOD and DOE, you spin out a third company, Company C. Company C is usually the mediated group that usually has American board members who have security. They usually outnumber the indigenous board members from the Company B. And that way we're supposed to be, as the CFIUS group, making sure that there isn't foreign control of assets that we think are important. So we created this as a mechanism. And then we had on the books IEPA, which is, I just taught recently in my class on national security law, which is the Emergency Economic Powers Act that the president has, which if you read IEPA, is one of the most powerful instruments that the president has at his disposal to negate contracts that are taking place in order to have for national security interests. So IEPA has been used in companies that have been dealing with Iran. It's been used with companies that have been dealing with North Korea. Once the president announces that emergency, and then with CFIUS, as you pointed out, we then passed FIRMA, which is the Foreign Investment Risk Review Act, which is why we're here today, because the FIRMA changes have given CFIUS power now extending into bankruptcy proceedings. Because that was a gap that we saw that our adversaries were using without there being, with the bankruptcy judges and bankruptcy bar, not fully grasping what the potential consequences would be of having certain foreign powers taking over certain aspects of critical industries, which would then potentially affect our supply chain, for our weapon systems, which we were particularly concerned about. And I'll just end with this question. When do you think your iPhone or your handheld is at its most vulnerable to someone messing with it? When it's on. That's a good answer. But in particularly, I imagine you are all good net citizens and you always do your updates. When you let your product be updated, you have absolutely no idea what's happening. It's an extraordinarily vulnerable moment. And whoever can control that update can inject code that can be quite malicious, unbeknownst to the user, and code that just sits there waiting to be activated whenever who controlled that update wants it to be activated. So this issue of if you do not know in your circuits and boards that all of the software is something that we have the provenance on, our multi-billion-dollar satellites that are sitting and orbiting right now, if they have some of these ATOP potential circuits, we are not sure on their reliability. And as we sit here, I will tell you, if there is a problem with our satellite technology, it is a major strategic vulnerability, since all of our weapon systems are all tied to the time-space motion of how we put steel on target. It is quite concerning, and I have another group that's trying to look at what should be the appropriate space rules and regs at an international level, because all the players are not agreeing on what the appropriate rules and regs should be. And as you know, this is a very competitive market. There are a lot of businesses that go forward and then fall back. They go into bankruptcy in the space, and we are saying in the government, we have to look much more closely about how these bankruptcy proceedings are unfolding as to who truly is going to be in control of these potential critical micro products that we all are going to sit on.
So Harvey, talk about that some. I mean, as I was looking at this and preparing for this program, one thing that really struck me is trying to figure out what was different about bankruptcy. I mean, clearly you've identified that if a company just tries to sell sensitive high-tech assets to some Iranian company or something, there's going to be a lot of review of that. They can't just haul off and do that. What was different about bankruptcy? What gaps still exist? Have the changes you talked about, the amendments in FIRMA to CFIUS and their powers, are we okay now? Are there still things about the bankruptcy process that make it more vulnerable to exfiltration and an avoidance of the protections that are in place?
Right. So you're in Washington, right? So all we have is acronyms and alphabet soup, right? So if I say out this acronym, the first part of the questions I tell my students will be a free trip to Europe if you can say what the acronym is. But there'll be a second part to get the real trip, okay? So if I said NAICS, what would that mean to you?
Means I'm not going to Europe. I don't know.
So you don't have the chance to go.
Exactly.
So that is the North American Industrial Classification System. And we have 27 categories. And why it's significant, as you're saying, why there's a gap, is one of the numbers is tied directly to semiconductors.
Which was ATOP.
Which is ATOP. But
so in ATOP, why didn't it get flagged? I mean, that's what's interesting. How was this able to go through without any review?
Because at that time, there was no jurisdiction that we had in CFIUS or FIRMA to look into that transaction and say, stop. And the judges involved in bankruptcy, whereas this, as you said, this happens every day. Yeah. These guys came in, they wanted to do it. There was no flagging that this might be potentially significant. So for the second trip to Europe, if you knew what the acronym stood for, the second question was going to be, could you tell me the semiconductor and related device manufacturing NIC number? And the answer would be, I would fall off this chair if anyone would be able to do that. I feel quite confident if anyone could do that number. So what we're saying is, this is now, to use the phrase, the bankruptcy community is now woke. You are now, or you've taken the red pill, if you understand the Matrix analogy. How many Matrix fans? Okay, so
More people
less than I thought. So the
and you know, it's probably mostly engineers. So
but
whoever just
who
raised
didn't
their hand,
self-identify to begin with.
Yeah.
But the red pill is the Matrix is when you take it and then you see the Matrix. This is the moment that we're coming to the bankruptcy community and saying, now that you're falling under FIRMA and we have this jurisdiction, we need an education campaign. Not all bankruptcy proceedings are the same. Certain companies, certain areas, we think require, from the concept of, if you remember constitutional law, more strict scrutiny rather than rational basis. There has to be a stronger look into who is coming in, what is the role of that particular company in our supply chain, what are the potential consequences if a foreign entity gets control of that and decides to do something different with the line production. That's why I'm here, and that's why we think it's so important and significant.
And so in a case like ATOP, at that time, you're saying there was no jurisdiction with CFIUS. And one thing you and I had also talked about is it's very hard, and we'll talk in a little bit about the role of bankruptcy judges, but the players in the bankruptcy system, I mean, you have a lot of the people who want the sale to go through, right? The debtor, the buyer, et cetera. The creditors usually like, this is great, we're going to get more money. We like money, that's good. Only party that might be sad, and I think this came up in ATOP, is the losing bidder, but they're generally held not to have standing to raise this. So you kind of end up with like a black hole where it just slips through. But now, tell us, under the FIRMA amendments this year, is there any sort of systematic way for CFIUS review to happen? Does someone have to trigger that? I mean, how does that work?
So I think what we have to do is, first is to kind of get everyone up to speed why FIRMA is interesting, and sort of what are the expanded jurisdiction. So very quickly, under the FIRMA rules, when a transaction involves a country of special concern that has the strategic goal of acquiring technologies that affect U.S. technologies, that should trigger something.
Okay.
So the first thing is, when you lay bare who exactly is behind that bid to come in, if it is one of the known countries that is clearly announced, as the Chinese have in their 2025 plan, that they want to acquire this technology, or Iran, take any, or even some of our frenemies, the French and Israelis, that should trigger something inside the proceeding.
So the first step, the who's behind the
Right.
purchase, that alone triggers a scrutiny.
Sure.
Okay.
Then the second issue should be, what is the national security effects of the cumulative market share that will fall under the control of the foreign persons? Is this, so right now, if you take 5G, we do not have a robust market of Western producers who are operating in the 5 pillars of 5G. The pillars might be, some people have to be able to lay cable for information, or who's making the routers. This should not shock you, or maybe it will. Huawei is a dominant player, number 2 or 3 or 1, in each one of the 5 pillars. We are saying to our allies, you do not want Huawei in your system. The Brits and the Germans are negotiating about whether or not they're feeling more comfortable having that foreign entity controlling part of their 5G network. We're saying we should be going with Ericsson or another sort of Western player that we feel more comfortable with. But if you can imagine, the Chinese decided, well, we're going to try and take over Ericsson. We're going to dominate the market. We're going to do a full spectrum domination because we believe we can do that. We have subsidized companies. We will make the products cheaper. If cheapness is the way you're going to do it for cost and performance, we're going to win. We think if the world gets wired up with now China as the backbone of our internet network for all the Internet of Things, the world has changed dramatically and strategically.
So Harvey, let me ask you this. There are, as everyone here knows, a lot of bankruptcy sales. There are thousands and thousands and thousands every year. Is there a systematic way that these are always screened? That's sort of what, I mean, I understand what you're saying about we look at who the player is. We talked about their different types of assets, you know, the 27 areas, we care about those. But how would we find out in a particular case? You see what I'm saying? I mean, it's like...
So how do you scale this? It's always the problem, right?
Yeah.
So what we're thinking is that we have to engage the community in an extensive education campaign. And then as you're saying, do we need changes in the bankruptcy code that would list our NAIC rule numbers? So as soon as a proceeding came into your courtroom or lawyers were involved in representing this, it would immediately trigger, oh, we have to have a greater scrutiny. This is not a takeover of a burger joint. This is not a takeover of coming in trying to help a hotel chain. Though, depending on what the cameras are, you may be interested, but that's something else. But
I'm still thinking about the burgers.
So that once you get involved, and when you think about what the categories are, they're not particularly surprising or shocking to you, and they deal with aircraft manufacturing, ball and roller bearing manufacturing, electronic computer manufacturing, military armed vehicles, guided missiles, optical instruments, and lens manufacturing. They are what you normally say, we talk about dual use. And if you know that it has a clear military capability and function, the Chinese have made it very clear they're interested in that. So it would be a triggering event so that the bankruptcy court and the bankruptcy bar would say, when you're pulled into this issue, I will tell you, when we, in 2011, started to call out Huawei hired a very prominent former public official who had been a major official in one of our major departments. They came into us and tried to explain to us that Huawei wasn't that bad, that why were we becoming so paranoid inside the counterintelligence community? And we said, sir, are you still getting briefings? Are you still getting all of the classified briefings? Why don't you come back behind the green door? And why don't we talk about what this company has done in the last 6 to 8 months, which has clearly demonstrated they had violated a number of business ethic rules and they had created criminal activity to actually steal the products. They were literally physically trying to steal the IP, different than exfiltrating it through a remote computer access. So that's what we said, we need to have the community understand as best as we can. If you have an actor, like right now, ZTE has been fined repeatedly for violating trading with Iran. Like, how many more violations does a company have to make before our community says, you're just a bad actor, and you should not be participating as a white knight in this space because you've demonstrated your allegiance is not to making money to the shareholders. Your allegiance ultimately is going to be to your home country.
And so we have a situation where, I mean, what I'm hearing you say too is that there's no we have the problem. I think the audience clearly, a lot of our questions I want to focus on what's the problem, why is it a problem. I think we see that. At least I hope they do. And so sort of continuing to probe this, how is it happening and what can we do about it? Question, because that's what people here care about. I mean, I don't think most of them are going to go work in counterintelligence or, oh, that'd be exciting.
We are looking for people.
Yeah, but there are a few good men. But one thing it sounds like is there's no mechanism for a standardized review. There's not like a CFIUS monitor appointed to bankruptcy cases or whatever, whereas in which every bankruptcy sale, no matter what, has to be reviewed. That's just impractical and not doable, is what you're saying. I mean,
What I'm saying is,
so we have to take another time.
right, so as the Marines say, we've admired the problem, but now what are viable
Right.
solutions, which you're saying?
Exactly.
So, but
Thousands of bankruptcy sales every year.
and all of them are not critical or significant for this problem set.
Right.
So what you're saying is, what would be a mechanism by which we could screen all of these 1,000 proceedings
Yes.
to get the proceedings that we think we should have more attention on?
That is my question.
Yes. So I think there's a variety of ways of thinking about how to do that. And one would be to make the bankruptcy judges au courant and sensitive to what this phenomena is, and giving them a set of questions that they could pose, and depending on the answers that were filled out very quickly,
And they could do that for every sale.
they could do that for every sale. I remember when I was a law clerk, when the case came in, the first question was, when you had to look at who the participants were, did the judge have to recuse himself? It was a pass, go, no go. And if the judge knew the litigants or he knew the issue in dispute, the judge would come out.
Step one, you're out.
Step one, it's like, what's the first thing you write in a brief? The first thing you write in a brief for a judge is, does this court have jurisdiction? It's always a jurisdictional question. This could be a primary You have a set of questions that come into the courtroom, and if it came out that, no, this is not triggering one of the 27 areas we're interested in, you move on.
Then
right?
you're fine.
Right, fine. If you move in to one of these areas, then there'll be another set of review that the judge should think about, how to go forward as to how transparent. We were saying, I think you have section 1703A4 that allows you to think through, and section 3017 in the procedure.
rules, yeah.
The rules. There's a procedure by which in 3017, the judge could have this open to find out what is behind it and who truly is behind, and why there might be concern for that foreign entity coming in.
Do you think, in terms of implementing that, I mean, would you recommend that the bankruptcy code itself or the bankruptcy rules be amended, or that there be other provisions in the law that be amended to sort of mandate that, to like say, here are the questions you have to ask me? It could be put in the bankruptcy rules.
Yeah.
It could be put in conjunction with the sale rules or the plan rules or all of those things, and systematize that? Or is it enough, do you think, to do what you're talking about in Camille Stewart's article that
Yeah.
you referenced, talks about a whole series, developing a training program for judges, because they're the ones that ultimately get to call the shots, and they would be able to say, oh, this is one of the countries that we're worried about, this is one of the 27 areas we're worried about, I want to ask more questions. Is that the best? But not change the rules, right? Leave the existing
Right.
rules in place, because they clearly have the power to throw monkey wrenches into the system, but they have to know there's a problem. And I'm sure in ATOP Tech, the judge would not have known. I mean, they're not a bad citizen. It's just like, it's just another bankruptcy sale. And as we talked, none of the parties either have a self-interest in doing it, or have, if they do, have standing to object.
So there's two thoughts, whenever you go down this line of work. Once we make it clear what we've identified, these 27 areas, our adversary goes, oh, I should be interested in this. They've helped do the homework for me. This is great. I should be targeting this because they themselves have said it's important to them. So you have to say, okay, that's the first step of recognition. I like many of you in this room, I've been in different parts of my life trying to get legislation out of the Congress.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I would say it is not a job for the short-winded. So if there would be an easy bipartisan understanding of why this is significant, I would say there is a recognition on the Senate Armed Services Committee, House Armed Services, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and the House Permanent Intelligence Select Committee, what we call SAS, CASC, HPSI, and SISI. There clearly is, it's my world that this is what we do. So there's clearly bipartisanship, but then you want to go to the bankruptcy committees and the Rules Committee, which, as you know, ultimately are controlled by the Judicial Conference and the Supreme Court, and get that bankruptcy committee. And we've gone to and spoken to the Federal Judicial Center to Cook to talk about this issue, and who staffed the bankruptcy. We've gone to the AO, Administrative Office of Federal Courts, and say this is the bankruptcy area. Can we figure out a way to inject this information in the educational process of the bankruptcy judges to sensitize them to what the potential national security interests are? So we're saying to work with you guys and the ABI, to work with you to figure out what is the mechanism to get the word out, to get the message out, and to sensitize this community that you are perceived elegantly as a soft underbelly in the industrial defense-based structure in order for the adversary to suck out or exfiltrate and place power inside the system. And that they look at this, with big data, the ability to start looking at who's playing in the space, who's in distress in the space. How do we, if I was the adversary, how do I get my fingers into that pot so that I'm able to start manipulating the process and the procedures to my advantage? That is, as you know, under international law, espionage per se is not a, quote, outlawed. There's a doctrine of non-interference, but we spend hundreds of billions of dollars in our intelligence and counterintelligence world, as do our adversaries, because there's huge payoffs in order to understand what the intent of the adversary is, and more significantly, the capability of the adversary. Because when you know the capability, you then are able to understand your risk matrix of what you should be concerned about. And that industrial base where you guys play in those 27 industries as we get to know them, that's becoming the crosshair, the target for what our adversaries want to do.
Harvey, let me ask you a question. Lots of the audience here and people will be watching when this episode airs on April 25th. They're lawyers. Is there anything a lawyer involved in a bankruptcy sale can do? Or
Sure.
What could they do? Or
So
how can these people save our country?
How many lawyers are in the room? So I'm going to ask you. Everyone's a lawyer. I'm going to ask you. It's like my people. So I'm a former dean of a law school. I think we don't have enough lawyers in America. It's a minority position, but nonetheless. The question I have for you is, in your firms, do you know whether or not your data at rest is encrypted? Only a few hands have gone up. If you have partners in the room, and just think about your firm being targeted by a nation state because you're involved in a transaction they're really interested in and would like to get information on. As my dad used to say, it's really helpful to know what the bottom line of your adversary is in a financial negotiation, because that way you never leave money on the table. That's your role. I will tell you all, you're incredibly rich targets for information acquisition when there is an issue that our adversary is intrigued and interested in. A number of law firms, so wearing my American Bar Association hat as one of the chairs of the National Task Force on Cyber and the Law, formerly with Judy Miller, that we stepped down. I cannot tell you how many significant law firms have been embarrassed by the penetration.
Wow.
One of my favorite trial lawyers, we sat down privately, a legendary trial lawyer from the South, and I said, so what's your password? And he went, password. I said, you know, you're considered one of the smartest trial lawyers in America, and that is one of the dumbest things I've heard. And he looked at me and he said, well, I can't remember all these passwords. So he's from the South. I said, do you hunt? He said, of course I hunt. I said, why don't we make this your password? My dog won't hunt. Because I can remember that.
Oh my.
So that's his new password. I won't tell you who it is. But his password is, my dog won't hunt. He can remember that. And then you start doing a whole set of why we began this, why we're laser focused on artificial intelligence. Because that ability to start banging what your potential passwords are is usually a finite thing for people to remember. Birthdays, children's names, pets' names, university you went to. Just think of what your tendency is not to use a random generated password. And with AI, the more we can understand as the end to start attacking those machines, we really need a machine solution, an AI solution, not that your little password is going to. And how many of you, I won't ask you to raise your hand, have your password written under your keyboard and a yellow sticky? I will tell you, many people in the intelligence community, when I walk through rooms, I often just randomly pick up keyboards and go, really? Really, Fred?
That's great.
You know, you have a PhD from MIT and you can't remember this? Really? Boom.
See, if he'd just used password, he would. Well,
Yes,
Harvey,
exactly.
We need to finish so everyone can, before the next session, go change their passwords from password. Thank you so much for spending an hour with us talking about this. And as I said, this episode will air on April 25th. And then next month, we're fortunate to have two distinguished guests, the Honorable Rick Feeling and Jennifer McLemore, and that program will air on May 23rd. Until then, this is Charles Tabb, and inviting you to elevate your understanding and keep your eye on bankruptcy.
And let me thank you for doing this. Let me thank Sam for giving us the opportunity, Sid Brooks and Camille Stewart, whose paper's coming out. This has been great, and I think this is, I hope, the beginning of a dialogue with us, the national security community, so we can make bankruptcy safe for the world.
And change your password.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Stay tuned for a live Q&A with our panelists.